we have had many people commenting from all over the world outside of our business about how the 21st century is going to be the Asian century, and so it seems particularly appropriate that we should have that as our focus in this inaugural meeting. It seemed to me that it would be appropriate to kick off with trying to find out, what we think we know about the publishing that's going on in the region. And to do that, I decided I was going to draw upon our recently published STM report, which came out in October of last year. It's the 5th edition. It's about 212 pages long. It's freely available on our website, so you can go and download it there. The developments in the industry are reflected in this report. It's an attempt to try and bring together, in the way of a review journal, I suppose, all that we know or think we know about the way our industry works, about publishing in general, the research and other environments that contribute to it. And the report itself, as I say, is its 5th edition. And you can see it's actually grown quite significantly over the last 12 years or so, from a relatively small report of about 35 pages up to the position that it now has. And it's expanded in all the areas that we have been concentrating in terms of basic stuff about the journal, about open access, and about innovation and new developments. One of the things that the report is particularly good at emphasising is the way in which things have changed over time. And I think because we're all so busy, we often don't appreciate the amount of change that is going on around us. We're so used to standing on a treadmill and running to stay in the same place that we don't appreciate that the world around us is evolving much faster than we think, and that things that we think seem to be quite static are actually moving more fast than we think. And one good example of this would be a slide that appears in the latest report, which looks at changes in publishing models. And you can see here that, and this is data that comes from Universities UK report on the transition to open access, that one of the key developments has been the expansion of open access as a business model in its various guises, from pay to publish, gold OA, to pay to publish with no payment, if you like, which is sometimes called diamond. That's the yellow as opposed to the gold bit at the top, to the hybrid, where a choice is available for people to opt to go open access within a subscription journal, and then, of course, subscription journals themselves. And there is a small sliver in the middle of both of these that represent the delayed OA approach that in many ways started off with the DC Principles Group and their response to the NIH policy proposals of several years ago. So we can see that actually things are advancing quite fast, but as we will discover as we go through and look at how this is affecting different parts of the world, it's happening at different rates in different regions and also in different subject areas. Jason mentioned about how STM is a reflection of these changes that are going on, and it's probably worth looking at what our membership looked like in 2015. And before somebody points out, as I know, these numbers do not add up to 100. This is rounding errors, those of you that are familiar with that. But 4 years ago, we had about 8% of our membership in this region. Now, we have 50% more, 12%. And while I think that reflects on activities that we have undertaken, I'm also fairly sure it reflects on the increasing importance and activities that are going on within all the nations of the region. So I'm going to turn now to looking at our report, and I'm going to pick out the stuff that relates to the regions, the nations of this region. The first graph that appears, and I think is relevant, is actually one that looks about spending on content. And you can see the different regions of the world are split out in terms of their contribution overall. And this is data that comes from a Springer Nature report of last year. And it shows that for China and Southeast Asia, the area I've boxed in red, about 9% of global spending on content happens in the region. Now, I know from a conversation I had with Lindsay yesterday that she thinks that actually doesn't really reflect what the reality ought to be, that it ought to be actually a great deal higher. And indeed, in terms of the contribution in terms of research, which we'll come on to next, it does not really reflect the contribution that's being made. And there are a number of reasons for this, and I suspect they relate to the fact that the market in certain parts of the region was somewhat nascent. That is to say that, particularly in China, there was a desire to get market penetration on behalf of the leading publishers, and this resulted in what were really very good opening offers in terms of the way in which things were sold there. Now, this is something that I think we're all going to have to deal with as things develop. Certainly, Mark Garlinghouse and I, who were in Beijing on Monday and Tuesday, were constantly being faced with the issue that, in the view of many of the people we were meeting, they didn't quite understand how gold open access, as currently understood, would actually be feasible, because they were looking at current subscription spending. And of course, at gold AIA level, people would think that that didn't look like a very fair transition. But I think that just reflects on the fact that we made some really good, or bad, depending on how you want to look at it, opening offers to particularly China in that region. Why does this not reflect the overall reality? Well, if we look at the R&D expenditures, and this comes from the Science and Engineering Indicators 2018 report, we can see that actually the areas of the world that are spending the most on R&D are in fact in this region. So East and Southeast Asia, which is principally China, is spending something in the order of about 37% of the world total, and that is the largest. It outstrips the North American total at 27 and the European total at 21. And there's also obviously a significant contribution from South Asia, which is mainly India, and also from Australia and Oceania. And you put all of this together, and this represents a very significant amount of money that's being spent and invested into research. And we're already seeing some of the consequences of that, of course, in terms of research output. But it clearly indicates that we are very much moving towards an Asian century where R&D is concerned. We don't have figures on the relative increase around the world, but we do know that that has been pretty massive in China, where there's been upwards of 10 to 20% increases on an annualized basis, which outstrips virtually anywhere else in the world. Now, the results of that, I think, are fairly clear. And we can look at the shares of articles, and this is comes from an Elsevier report and reflects the period 2010 to 2014, and I've got a more up-to-date version on the next slide. And here, this has been split into two. One is at the very high level on the left, and then there's a sort of a focus in on all the lines at the bottom on the right. And what we can see is the slow decline of overall world share of papers coming from the US being also reflected in the rise of the Chinese output. But it isn't just China. If we look lower down in the graph, we can see that India has made huge strides over this period, and Korea is also moving forward. Many of the other nations and regions have been relatively static over that period. One unfortunate example that doesn't follow this trend is in fact in Japan, where the amount being spent relatively on R&D has actually not declined in absolute terms, but certainly not increased as fast as it probably needed to do, and that is reflected in the paper output. If we actually look at the article shares from a more recent report, and this is from the National Science Board report, it shows a number of different lines, which I imagine are difficult for you to see, but I will go through them. The very top faint blue line is the European Union contribution, so it represents 28, shortly to be 27 countries. And that's why that sits at the top. If you divided it out into the individual countries, of course, it wouldn't sit at the top. The next line in a slightly darker blue is the United States. The next one in brown is China. And we can see on this report that sometime around about 2016, the Chinese output of papers exceeded that of the US. And that is, I think, a very significant event, and one which the Chinese are aware of, and I think everybody else is also aware of. At the same time, there's also been a significant rise in the contribution of many of the other developing countries when they're put together. That's the purple line. India is the very rather faint mauve line. And then right down at the bottom, we can see, I'm again reflecting what I commented on in the previous slide, the relative decline of the Japanese contribution to this. These trends, I think, are only going to continue, particularly when we think about the driver, which is the R&D expenditures. And so I think we're going to see these lines rather extend into the future in the same way, unless, of course, there are policy changes within the countries that currently are not relatively spending as much as they used to, or are actually planning to spend more. Now, this supply of content poses issues for us as an industry. Since we're talking here about mainly journal articles, and since journal articles get their imprimatur from a peer review process, how that peer review process is able to happen becomes increasingly important. And Publons published a peer review supply and demand chart showing different territories in the world and the extent to which they either provided peer review or demanded it. And we can see that of the Asia-Pacific nations that are mentioned and territories mentioned in this chart, which are outlined in red, there are significant imbalances in virtually every one of these territories. I mean, the biggest imbalance is in China, where essentially the demand for peer review outstrips its supply by about 3 to 1. But there is a similar and probably even greater magnitude, although at a lower level, in India, also in South Korea, and also in Taiwan. And clearly, this is a situation which it's going to be very difficult to sustain going forward. Who are making the biggest contribution in terms of delivering the peer review? Well, it's happening through some of the European countries, and it's also happening from the US. And clearly, this level of imbalance is going to become more and more appropriate, and people will probably be more and more concerned about it. So I think as an industry, it's sort of an issue that, given that we're here to manage peer review, it's going to become a top-of-mind discussion item, if it isn't already in your strategic agendas. We looked at output. I now want to turn to looking at the quality dimension. And here we have an Elsevier report that looks at the world share of citations over 2010 to 2014. And again, you've got the full graph on the left and a focus on the lower portion on the right. And again, we can see huge strides have been made by China in terms of increasing the number of citations that its papers get, and the relative decline of citation share in the United States. Similar variations are obviously occurring at the more detailed level when we get down to some of the other individual nations. Large numbers of the European nations have tended to be relatively flat in their shares, although interestingly Italy seems to have bounced up quite quickly. Japan, again, I suspect reflecting the R&D investment, has shown a small decline, but India and South Korea are also advancing in this area in a way that perhaps others had not anticipated. And I think it's also quite interesting that Russia is also showing signs of improvement in its overall performance, although of course it is bouncing along at the bottom of this particular graph. By the way, I should say to all of you that we will be putting all of these slides onto the STM website. So I know some of you have been photographing them, and that's fine, but we will also be putting all of this stuff onto our website so that you're in a position to be able to look at it at your leisure. Or equally, you could find these graphs in the STM report, because that's where they all come from. In terms of quality, the National Science Board looks at things in a slightly different way. They look at the share of science and engineering publications in the top 1% of cited publications. So this is looking at those most important publications as defined by being the most cited. And then they've also divided that up by region and by country. And here we can see that the US remains pretty dominant in this area. The EU is slowly advancing towards that, but the most significant increase has been that of China. And in the top papers, Japan and India are relatively constant, but still an important participant in the whole system. When we look at citation inflation, an interesting picture emerges. There is a general tendency for our authors to cite more over time, and that's really reflected, I think, in the top graph, which is the world. Now, there are a number of factors relating to this. It isn't just simply that they're trying to game the system, although we can't obviously rule that out. It's also to do with changes in the way different disciplines decide to regard citation behaviour, but it's also to do with the extent to which different parts of the world have made greater or lesser contribution at a very high level to the overall literature. And here we can see China really advancing in on the rest of the world. Now, there are two ways of looking at this. Either there is a policy that's encouraging Chinese authors to cite more, or it's just a reflection of their increased visibility and importance in the world. And it's very difficult to tell from this sort of data which of those that really is. This is a rather interesting and I suspect completely invisible chart for those of you at the back, which looks at the degree of open access by different nations. And the green lines are, not surprisingly, green OA, and the orangey gold lines are gold OA. And it starts right at the top with Switzerland, which surprisingly has the greatest combination of both green and gold OA. And right down at the bottom, we have the Russian Federation, which has the lowest. It's worth saying that even at the lowest, we're looking at around about 17% combined in Russia, and probably around about 40% in Switzerland combined. And the other nations are sort of sitting in the middle between those two. The three nations that get mentioned in the context of our report and this particular piece of data are Japan, which is quite high up relatively, then India, and China, interestingly, not quite so high up. Now, I know that Lindsay in particular has wanted to dispute this when we were talking about it last night. Do you want to say what you think about this now? Because I think it'd be quite useful. Or do you want to wait until I come to the end?
My point being, if you look at the Web of Science research...
Can you stand up and so everybody can hear?
My point being that if you look at Web of Science in terms of research output, China actually leads the way in terms of gold research output globally. So although it is a small percentage of the overall Chinese output, China is leading the way in terms of gold research output.
Thank you. I mean, of course, I'm merely reflecting what sits in our report, and you will almost certainly be more up to date in terms of your particular specialist areas than we are. This is an attempt to try and summarise the world that we do every 3 years, so it's always going to be at a somewhat generic level. So I'm really pleased that you were able to offer that thought last night over dinner, and which we've been able to incorporate today. But I think you've got some other thoughts that might come up later on when we have questions and alternative views. Now, those are mainly the charts that have appeared throughout the report. What also appears is some narrative items, and I just want to pick some of those out as well. These almost entirely relate to China. So, for example, STM Publishing in China, where it appears in our report, it talks about the number of journals, and the Chinese Association for Science and Technology in 2017, in what I think is called its Blue Book, listed 5,020 Chinese journals. And of these, 548 were in the English language, and that's about 11%. And half of that 11% were co-published with foreign publishers. But the scene in China is very different to that which applies in other parts of the world, in that academic and scholarly publishing is hugely fragmented, and about 96% of the titles in that list are the only title that the publisher publishes. And it's quite difficult to interpret pricing as well, because in many cases these journals are effectively subsidized by the government or departments of the government. And in fact, one observation which we made when we were on a trip a few years ago is that if you were to ask many Chinese publishers what their revenue was for their titles, they would find that a hard question to answer. Because in many cases, they're not getting revenue from sales, they're getting subsidized income from the government supporting those journals. And of course, it could be argued that this is effectively sponsored open access. This is diamond open access as it's understood elsewhere. Although it's quite interesting that if you try and suggest to them that that's a form of open access, they don't quite see it that way. But I do think that's worth bearing in mind. This low level of revenue obviously makes it not as attractive as it might be for entrepreneurs within China to indulge in the type of consolidation that we've seen in the industry elsewhere. And so far, there's a very fragmented position for Chinese publishing. And indeed, the former minister Wu Shuling, who is deputy managing director of the Chinese Publishing Association and probably one of the most influential voices in China, is concerned about the need for the Chinese publishing system to improve, and he particularly is keen on the idea that there should be both greater internationalization and learning from the international community, and also a need for innovation, because the digital transition is fairly rudimentary at the moment, and he can see that both of those things need to happen. There are, of course, immediate question marks that I'm sure will have occurred in your mind, and they have in mind, and I have often raised it with him, that it's great that they want to join and participate in the international system, but they also have some policy constraints that make that difficult. And therefore, I think there is a sort of tension there between what he recognises as being possible and what regulations allow. Open access in China, we have a number of points that have been made in the report. National Science Foundation China and the Chinese Academy of Sciences mandated deposit into repositories within 12 months. That was in 2014. And CAS has developed two portals. There's the Institutional Repository Grid of CAS, which is a collection of 102 repositories. But there's also the China Open Access Journal Portal. The Ministry of Science and Technology, which obviously has the ISTIC department within it, is developing its own open access policy. And mostly what we're seeing is aligning with US policies, but there is support for the Max Planck initiative, the OA 2020 initiative. Although it has to be said that when one explores below the surface of that support, it's clear that many, in particularly the CAS, are aware of what that might mean for China as now the main producer of papers in the world. And this has obviously a profound consequence for them in terms of what it might mean in terms of them having to provide those papers for free through APC-type arrangements. But it's interesting that from what we can tell, the main driver is to increase quality and transparency rather than necessarily being issues connected with either public access or open access as it applies in other parts of the world. So to try and summarise then the main headline points that appear in the report. The first point is that the APAC R&D investment is absolutely huge, and it's outstripping every other region in the world, especially in terms of from China, and especially in terms of its rate of growth. And these consequences are only just starting to feed through, so we're going to see much more of this. It's led to rapidly increasing article shares in China and India. And again, I think we're going to see these trends continue. Quality as measured by citations is also improving, especially from China. And again, there's no reason not to think that we're going to see an evening out of the quality disparities that currently exist between the different regions of the world. For us as publishers, leaving those two other points aside, there is a severe imbalance in peer review going on, with demand and supply being not matched, especially from China and India. And clearly, one important role is to ensure that, given that the Chinese and the Indians are actually making a huge contribution in terms of papers, we do need them also to start making more of a contribution in terms of review. And that may involve all sorts of issues connected with cultural practice and our own policies that need to be looked at. Revenues from APAC at the moment are the lowest of the regions of the world, but they are growing. And I think here, as I mentioned, we're dealing with a legacy issue as much as anything. And in terms of the data from the EU Science Monitor, which we saw, OA activity is at the lower end of the international ranges so far, but there's no reason to suggest that that won't grow as time goes on. Those are the main points that appear in the latest edition of the STM report, and I'm pretty sure that those of you who are experts in the different nations of this region will have points that you'll want to offer up as an addition or perhaps a correction to what you've heard here. But that's what I have to say, I think, at the moment about this, and I'd be very happy to hear comments and questions. So thank you very much for your attention.